decimation of Native people in the Americas, slavery, Jim Crow, and the like. Race has been called the great American obsession. Certainly we can't solve the issue of race today, but we do think that by using dialogue, that we'll be able to shed some light on that topic and make progress. What we're going to do today is have a conversation that we're going to invite all of you, our audience members, to participate in. In that regard, what will happen is that I'm going to throw out questions to our panelists that I'm going to introduce to you in just a moment. We're going to talk for a little while. Think of it as a fireside chat, if you will. And then we'll ask you to ask our panelists certain questions, and we'll move on from there. So let me introduce our panelists to you. Starting on your far right is James Fridie III, an attorney at law from the Fridie Group that specializes in criminal, family, elder law, and municipal court practice. He is also a member of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Would you give him a hand, please? Next to James is Stacy Hawkins. She's an assistant professor at Rutgers School of Law in Camden, and she also serves on the boards of the Public Interest Law Center of Philadelphia and the Philadelphia Diversity Law Group. Would you please give a hand to Stacy? Next to Stacy is Tiffany Reid, the author of Colorblind, a mixed girl's perspective on biracial life, and host of Mixed Race Radio. She's also a commissioner of the Camden County Human Relations Commission. Please give Tiffany a hand if you would. And finally, Joyce Trotman-Jordan, who is a school and family counselor with the West Windsor Plainsboro School District, my old alma mater back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. She's also a social justice advocate who works with children and families of diverse backgrounds for inclusion. All of our panelists, although we're going to move away from more formal trappings of panels, have decided that they're going to give an opening statement about race relations in America. But they've agreed along with me that as part of their opening statements, they're going to cover two things, which are one, what energizes them about the issue of race in America, and what aggravates them personally about that topic. So, James, would you please start us out?
I guess in terms of what aggravates me, I'm going to take you guys back a bit to 2008 when President Barack Obama was initially elected, and because he was the first African-American president elected, the media came up with this term that we were in a post-racial society. And as you can see with recent events like Ken mentioned, that's obviously not the case. So that was aggravating for me back then. It's certainly aggravating for me now in light of recent developments all over the country. What energizes me, I guess, is when I see, really what energizes me is the turnout that we have here today. And we have obviously people of all sort of races and probably different denominations here, and people that are realizing this is a conversation that needs to be had, because unfortunately, race is definitely still the elephant in the room, so to speak. There's still some issues everybody can learn when it comes to accepting people of different races, genders, sexual orientations. So I'm energized to see the turnout that we have here today.
Thanks. Stacy, if you would.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to participate. I want to follow on with this notion of this post-racial America and say that what aggravates me is not necessarily the claim, but a tension inherent in that claim. I think that the term post-racial America, regardless of the truth of that claim, right, embodies certain sentiments that I do think are real and tangible that we have to grapple with, which is one, this notion that there is some social distance from a time when we were very deeply raced in our country. That notwithstanding the story that Mr. Gordon told, right, that we are no longer largely racist, right? Those elements, to the extent that they exist, have been marginalized, they are minimal, and that we have some sufficient social distance from our very raced past, right, that allows us to claim that we are now post-racial. The other thing that I think that term embodies is this sense of race fatigue. In my line of practice and diversity practice, we have a term called diversity fatigue, right? When people are tired of hearing about something. And I think that this is embodied by, for instance, the Obama effect. You cannot at the same time, right, have a African American president of the United States and claim that Black people are still suffering under the weight of discrimination and oppression in America, right? There is a fatigue with the claims that, again, with the ascendance of a Black middle class, with the Oprah Winfreys, the Michael Jordans, the Barack Obamas of the world, that there is some sort of inequality that continues to plague us as a country, right? So notwithstanding, again, the truth of whether or not we live in a post-racial society, I think that those two contexts really are important. But they have a real tension, it seems to me, with the reality of persistent racial inequality and disparity in our country, right? Across every dimension of life for people of color, not just Black people, right? So social inequality, right? We are gonna talk, I think, about criminalization rates, right? Large incarceration rates of Black and brown men and women. Political inequality in terms of, you know, again, access to polls. We looked at the Voting Rights Act case, right, that came down, and the disenfranchisement of people of color. Economic inequality, and again, I don't have to cite the indicators. And so there is this real problem for me. What aggravates me is not the claim that we are a post-racial America so much as the tension that is expressed when we make that claim and yet live in a society in which we really do have a permanent underclass of people of color that we can't seem to get out from under. Now, what energizes me is that I became a lawyer because I wanted to be a lawyer in the great civil rights tradition of past luminaries like former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. And I really have committed my life and my work to trying to advance the cause of equality on behalf of the underclasses of America. And so I really find great pleasure in trying to reconcile these two, trying to find new ways of accommodating this new context, right? These claims of post-racial America where there's some social distance from our very deeply raced past, where there's some race fatigue going on, and trying to come up with new strategies for how we then bridge the gap between our present inequality and our promise, right, of a land of equality for all people, including people of color. And so that's what really energizes me.
Thank you, Stacy. Tiffany.
How do I follow that up? I'll start with two things that really aggravate me. First one, what are you? Second thing, when I have individuals, either that I know or don't know, make comments such as, well, I'm colorblind. I don't see any differences anymore. That aggravates me. What energizes me, as the host of Mixed Race Radio, every week I get the opportunity to interview parents raising biracial children, educators impacting a multicultural classroom, policymakers, doctors, you name it, just individuals who have a very unique perspective or an opinion to share. And so as I'm doing research, I get energized because I purposefully take efforts to re-educate myself and erase the fallacies and the false information that I was taught going through a public school system until I went away to boarding school, where I had the opportunity to have an everyday life experience interacting with different looking and different types of people. So what energizes me is being able to weekly get re-educated and then engage in conversations like this where I get to share what I've learned and then learn from you, actual real life experiences that continue to impact our lives and our communities.
Okay, thanks. Joyce.
Thank you. Wow, what aggravates me? It's the spook who sat by the door. The invisible, I guess how people perceive us as almost invisible. That is so frustrating for me. As an African American woman, I just find that just almost reprehensible. And so that's our daily walk. So I'm gonna come back down a little bit. Thank you, Stacy, for putting us up there. But the daily walk that I see myself and my sisters and my brothers having to contend with, as people almost don't want to see us. And all those little for coloreds only signs from back in the 60s, although they're not there, the tension is still there and the lack of respect. That is a big struggle for me. That is so aggravating and so frustrating. So, and I don't know how to break that down, because when I try to have conversations with some of my white colleagues, it would be, but we have a black president, so what's the problem? You know, and so it's trying to get to the bottom and to have that real conversation with my colleagues and my friends about, yes, but our experiences are different. And I'll talk about my work, well, not my work, but Peggy McIntosh's work on white skin privilege later on, but that helped to make it clear. On an upside, it's the children that I work with and the families that I work with who are so diverse and who are new to our country, as they're from Asia, and there is such a strong connection with their way of seeing the world, because their view is a lot more global than ours, because many of the children and families that I currently work with are from another country, so they have an opportunity to see race from another perspective, and they give me lots of hope, as so does my other brothers and sisters in America. Thank you.
Thank you. So folks, I want to start out with something that I think has struck a nerve with folks across America, and that is the killing of Trayvon Martin. I don't need to rehearse the facts. Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman. Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman. So panel, we don't need to rehearse the facts, but I would like a little clarity. Where did the killing of Trayvon Martin and the verdict of acquittal for George Zimmerman leave you emotionally? What was with you emotionally as you carried both of those things? Joyce, I want you to start us off.
All the way back to, was it 1956, Emmett Till, the murder of Emmett Till. It brought it all back. I mean, I cried the tears because I was not old enough at the time to remember Emmett's death, but I remember reading about it and how his mother had the courage to put his face on Jet magazine so that the world could see the hatred, and it brought it all back. I was reading something recently, it's this unconscious bias that many whites still hold towards blacks that George Zimmerman acted upon. I think we all have those unconscious biases, that which leads us not to engage in conversations about race cross-culturally, but George acted on his unconscious bias just as well as that whole jury. It was almost a circus. I can't tell you how frustrated I was at that verdict, but that unconscious bias that we all kind of need to have to tap into, self-included. Because the minute I walk into a conference or a room that's filled with whites, I go there, right? But I know I can't stay. So I'm aware of it, and I can pull myself out and approach someone that smiles, that gives me eye contact, and we can begin there. But it's that unconscious bias that George acted on. And my frustration, it leaves me almost speechless. Thank you.
Well, help me out, panel.
Okay.
Tiffany, did you want to take it next?
Oh, no, I just thought we were going down the line.
Okay.
No, we're not going to be like
Okay.
that.
Okay.
We're not going to be like that. We're just going to be,
Okay.
who would like to talk. But yeah, you have to help me out here, panel, because someone died. Right?
And then it's a child.
And a child died. You want to talk about how it left you, how it made you feel, Stacy?
I have to say that it was very emotional for me personally. I can't remember a time when I was more emotional than when I heard the verdict come down. And it really wasn't the killing itself, because at that point you still had faith in a system of justice, right? But when the verdict came down, that didn't vindicate that belief in a system of justice, at least not on behalf of Trayvon Martin and on behalf of his mother and father and on behalf of all of the other mothers and fathers of black and brown boys. For me, it was very personally demoralizing in terms of this continued faith right, in this vision of equality, right, in the post-racial America. But I have to say, and I will share this because it was so eye-opening for me, and it is consistent with what I said at the outset, that Joyce raised the fact that it reminded her, and many people have made the analogy between the killing of Trayvon Martin and the killing of Emmett Till. And I had the opportunity to have a conversation with a colleague of mine, but then in the same breath, you mentioned the unconscious bias, right? I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who is 70 plus. And I happened to ask him what he thought, being much closer to the history and the reality of the Emmett Till situation than I could ever be, about the comparison being made. And he told me something interesting, because it never unsettled me before, that he thought it was inappropriate. He thought it was inappropriate because he thought that it disserved the unique historic atrocity that was Emmett Till and the unique historic moment of lynching, right, that it represented, right? That the deep racist hate that animated that act versus the unconscious bias that animates the act of George Zimmerman, right? And so that's the difference in context that I was talking about at the outset, right? That we still struggle with deep inequality, but we do so in a very different context. And it requires different strategies for how we think about, how we respond to, even how we language sometimes, right? The issue of race relations. And so personally, I was very deeply hurt by it, but we have to put it in context. And I think that it requires us to have a whole new conversation, at least a renewed conversation, about what that means for us today.
Tiffany.
Yes, so I, in my desire to educate myself about situations that hurt me and hurt other people, when I heard of the verdict, of course I was hurt, I was frustrated, and for me the hurt and the frustration obviously comes from another young black man is gone. It's just gone for absolutely there's no excuse, there's no reason, he's just gone. And it's at the behest and at the decision of a young, for all intents and purposes, white kid, as he self-identifies. And so when I start to look at all of these instances, both historically and in our times in our society, where a white person remains in control of when and where a young black person dies, or a black person, just period, a person of color dies, it angers me. Because, I mean, we see Trayvon Martin, and what we tend to sometimes forget about are everyone who's gone before him. Obviously, every single day this is happening. It continues to happen, right? But in 1984, it was Bernie Goetz who shot 4 black males on a New York City subway after one of them asked for $5. All were unarmed. There was no physical altercation. He just shot all of them, paralyzing one. In 1999, it was Amadou Diallo. He's 23 years old, right? 2000, it was Patrick Dorismond, 26, a security guard shot and killed by a New York City officer who approached him asking for marijuana, okay? 2003, another 24-year-old male was shot. 2004, 2006, Sean Bell in New York City. 2009, Oscar Grant on the BART system in Washington, which Fruitvale Station memorialized his story. And last month, Ramarley Graham, 18. So, I hear about Trayvon Martin, and the pattern, which tends to find a way to hide itself because the media wants you to think everything is good and we are living in this post-racial society. When you remind yourself of the travesties that occur every single day, yes, I'm hurt, yes, I'm angry, but I'm exhausted, right? I'm exhausted because we find these ways to kind of tell ourselves that, with the election of the first biracial president, black president, to the presidency of the United States of America, and everybody thinking they don't see color and we're in this post-racial society, and then something like Trayvon happens again, isn't it supposed to put us all in our place? And it's doing a very good job of that, and that's what needs to stop. That's what we need to be responding to, those systems that still exist that continue to perpetuate inequality and death for people of color.
Okay, pass it down, but panel, I want you to think about this. whether you were lynched in the 1960s because of overt racial hatred, or whether you died because of implicit bias today, you're still dead. And as Tiffany says, the bodies pile up, right? And so, one of the things to think about is, does it really make a difference? Because either way, we're dead by implicit bias or overt hatred. Is there a different way we need to approach it because of that? Please, go right ahead.
Different way to approach, I guess, when you're talking about the bodies that are piling up as a result of this?
Exactly.
We're looking at the way the bodies are piling up.
Unfortunately, I don't know if it's a different way to look at it. I mean, she just did a fantastic job of giving you guys a chronological history of everything that is going on. And when we think about Trayvon, there's also another case in Florida that's very similar, where I think they were at a gas station and a white gentleman who was coming from a wedding and who had been drinking saw 4 black youths in the car, asked them to turn down their radio. Some words were exchanged, and he fired into the vehicle and literally just drove off. And they found out that one of the kids died. He was an honor student, if I believe, 17 or 18 years old. Very similar, and I think that's in Duval County, which is Jacksonville. So I don't really know if there's a different way to look at it. I hate to say I don't know, what it is that we can actually do to kind of change things, because I think one of the members of the panelists talked about it earlier. Kind of, there is this unconscious bias that sometimes, unfortunately, leads to these horrible events.
Right. And it comes from those stereotypes.
Right.
As you were speaking, James, I remembered the young man who was in the car accident in North Carolina who went looking for help. What are you supposed to do? I mean, he's injured, he's looking for help, and you see this African-American person banging on your door in the morning. Okay, I can understand that, just call the cops. Okay, you're thinking you're doing the right thing, but then the police shoot him. That is insane. I mean, that's insane. So again, how do we destructure, which probably isn't a word because it's all in our system. It's institutional, it's systemic, it's structural racism. We see a black man, therefore I need to be afraid. It's insane. So how do we undo that?
So obviously I raised the issue, so I feel obliged to respond to that. And I do think that there is some need to bridge a gap that is approaching a gulf, right, between the realities of, again, regardless of whether or not you accept the truth of being a post-racial America, you have to accept the truth of social claims of social distance and race fatigue, right? Those are real. And I think that by and large, if you can say that we attribute most of these modern tragedies to unconscious bias, right, and not explicit racial hatred, right, then calling people racist only alienates them, right? It doesn't bridge that gap. It doesn't help move us forward. And I think that part of what I at least try to do in my work is, again, it might seem silly, but start to renew a conversation, right, about how we relate to one another around race, because saying that this is still the result of the same racism that resulted in the death of Emmett Till, yes, the death is still the same, but the ways in which we go about addressing that, the causes, are very different. And I think that until we can start to bridge the gap between our perspective of, but we're still dead, and white America and other people who are not of color saying, but we're not racist, right? That's not the reason why you're dead. I think we are not going to make any headway on this problem. And we do need to make headway, because we do have persistent inequality, right? We do have persistent injustice on behalf of black and brown people. And that's a reality that we need to address. I don't think it's that productive, though, to address it by saying it's the result of racism, because today our context looks very different.
First, I actually think the racism that resulted in Emmett's death is the same racism that we're experiencing today. I do believe that it's the same racism. And as and it's, I feel like I can make jokes about being mixed all day long. So there's a part of me that wants to go and respond to these types of travesties of justice and I want a life for a life. I want an eye for an eye, I'm sorry. But then there's the other part of me that says, well, where will that get us except, a blind society, and we have to talk about this. And, the exhaustion sets in, the fatigue sets in. Sometimes you get tired of talking about the same thing when the key participants don't even understand how privileged they are in the situation, so what really can change from that, right? So if there's inherently a character flaw in half of the formula, the product will always be flawed. So what can we do? What needs to be done? In my opinion, we are still using textbooks in today's schools that depict slave plantations. You might hear about Banneker and what he did. You might hear about the exceptional black once or twice. We need schools to be teaching the real black history, the real American history, which is a mixed history. We need young people of color from the time they can start speaking and writing to understand images that empower and encourage their color and the history, the wonderful history associated with that, so that when they are going out to the store at 10 o'clock at night for some Skittles and an iced tea and they're confronted by a white vigilante, they will be properly empowered and encouraged to respond to that situation. And whether it's on a playground, on a SEPTA system or a public transportation system, or in a hallway and they're being bullied by monoracial individuals, they will have a history to go to that they'll be able to pull strength from and not respond in a way that is representing anything that is of lesser value than the white individual challenging them. That's where I feel it needs to start.
So panel, help me. Here's the deal. If we live in a quote-unquote post-racial America in which racial prejudice actually exists, but the very people that exercise that privilege do not believe that they have, do not believe that they are prejudiced, right? That's how that works, right? It's like we're in a post-racial America. I don't have bias, but I actually have those biases, right? Which also means I'm not going to come to the table, right? We don't have anything to talk about. So how does our conversation change, right? For example, it is notable that most of the people in this room appear to be people of color, not white people. And that's repeated over and over and over again, as Stacy was saying, right? So folks are unengaged on the issue of race if they are white. So it was hard enough just to get people to say, lynching's bad, so we need to do something about that. So how do we engage people who don't think they have a problem, is what I'm asking you.
That's a hard question. Okay, that's a hard one, but Tiffany is onto something. As an educator, I've noted, and I've been teaching for many, many, many years, I've noticed that whole social studies curriculum has almost just delineated, just wiped away African American history. So if you're not a parent and you don't know your history, I can tell you now, your kids in school, our black and brown kids are not getting it, all right? And by the time your son is in 3rd or 4th grade, research is showing that his teacher is now afraid of him because if he's a black or brown boy, he's a threat. All right? So Pedro Noguero does a lot of good work with that. He's out of NYU. I mean, a lot of work with black and brown boys and working in, especially if they're in majority schools. But that's something to think about. If you've got a kid in school, we really need to look at reinstituting African American history, and not just for the month of February, because everybody knows Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, and maybe Booker T. Washington, maybe, or George, Becker, but that's it. That's it, all right? Nothing else. So there's a real big educational push, and that's where teachers and students and community can come together and have that dialogue.
I absolutely agree. I've been blessed to be an educational consultant in the Philadelphia district in the Promise Academies. I worked with a teacher to customize a workshop that explored identity and self-esteem with the kids 9th through 12th grade in her honor stats class, algebra, and a few other math classes. And once you get past the fact that first of all, she warned me, don't look them in the eyes. Don't look them in the eyes. And I ended up looking them in the eyes and being able to connect with the kids in a way that moved past the fact that they are traumatized little people, little adults, I want to say. These teachers nowadays are so focused on, you need to do your homework, you need to do this, assuming that there's electricity on at the house to go have their homework done, that there's a parent who cares whether or not, the homework gets done. There are so many real life adult issues that these youngsters are dealing with that they just can't be kids. So to get back to your question, what do we do to engage and affect the individuals who don't even recognize their part in this? I say you hit them where it hurts. And I say that we create ways, programs, processes, new systems and institutions that will penalize them or take away a part of their paycheck if they don't show up at a discussion, if they don't enroll in classes or in opportunities that would see these individuals picking up trash on the side of the highway with other offenders. Because then I'm being offended by their lack of desire to understand where I've come from and where I'm trying to go. We can get really creative. I'm sure in this room alone, if we had a real conversation about everybody give one creative thing that we could do to engage or, affect the financial security of people who just say, I like my privilege, I'm keeping it, it's my story, I'm sticking to it, and I'm not going to be involved. We could find a way to really engage them against their will, which eventually, years later, because I think there's a lot of things in our own lives that we've been forced to do against our will, and it just became part of our everyday life. And why don't we find a way to flip the tables and see how that engagement goes?
Want to jump in?
Well, I'm a big fan, and I've heard it mentioned several times now, right? Unconscious bias, implicit bias. I was a diversity practitioner for 13 years before I became an academic. And I'm a big fan of implicit bias training. The social science is overwhelming. We all suffer from unconscious bias, right? And again, this is what I mean about languaging. So when you don't say, you're still racist, people. That's the reason why our black and brown boys are still dying. But that we all, right, if you have been socialized in America, right, the systemic, the institutionalized forms of stereotypical thinking, prejudicial images and ideas about minorities have penetrated your, mind. And you need to make yourself aware of that, right? And so consciousness raising is a big thing, right? Making sure that people start to have conversations about the ways in which we are all affected by unconscious bias and how that is what is causing us to have the bodies still pile up, right? It doesn't have to be that people are still racist, but we are still dealing with some race problems. They look a little bit different, but the result is the same. And if I could make it real again, I'm a lawyer, and so one of the things that I focus on are legal strategies, right, for dealing with inequality in our present context. The law right now of inequality says unless you can prove intentional discrimination, right, that's racism, right? Unless you can prove somebody was racist when they did something, you have no remedy under law. It's very hard in a post-racial society where people are arguing social distance, right, and race fatigue, and I can point to Barack Obama, we're not racist, right, to be able to recover under that kind of burden of proof, right? But when you're able to say, right, it's not the intentional racism that matters, it's the unconscious bias that has the same pernicious effects, right, that we need to really be addressing. We need to find some remedy under law. We need to find some strategies for identifying for people the ways in which they're unconscious bias, right? Through no intent of their own, that's why it's called unconscious, right? Is nevertheless having malicious effect that we need to be mindful of. And so I think I am on a consciousness raising campaign, right? We all need to make sure that we are first aware of and then checking, right, our assumptions at all times across all dimensions of our life.
James, before we go to our audience and engage them, get them to ask some questions, just tell me this, what do we tell young folks, young people of color who may identify with Trayvon Martin and some of the historical things that have been talked about? Do you mind if I ask if you have children?
Yes. I have a daughter.
You have a daughter. So for you, potentially, it's personal, right?
It is. My daughter's still young enough. She's only 4.5, but I have cousins that are similar in Trayvon's age bracket, I guess, so to say. So obviously, they had some questions, and they live in the inner city in Baltimore and D.C. and really all over the country. So, I never really got to touch on one of the first questions you asked about how did I feel when he first died. I immediately thought of them because, like I said, I can imagine them going to a store in Baltimore or D.C., going to pick something up and then running into somebody. What I just told them is, unfortunately, you saw what happened to Trayvon, and I don't really know the facts, so I wasn't there that night. It's a tragedy, no two ways about it. I just tell them to be vigilant, and you always have to be cautious and worry of your surroundings. And sometimes, just run. Call the police if you have your cell phone on you. You just be very vigilant. Unfortunately, that really didn't work out too well for Trayvon, and there was altercation, and he lost his life. But I guess the main thing I do tell them to do is to be vigilant at all times and always be aware of their surroundings.
Okay, thank you. Folks, we want to engage you now with an opportunity to ask our panelists some questions very specifically about the Trayvon Martin incident and the other ramifications that we've talked about. What we'd like you to do if you have a question is to please rise, come forward here, and I'll ask you to do just a couple of things. State your name, state the name of the panelist that you're addressing your question to, and the nature of your question. Certainly you all must have some questions about this issue. Please come on forward. Please come on forward. We have your name?
Hi, my name is Cynthia Primus.
Thank you. Who's your question for?
Actually, anyone can answer.
Okay.
I'd like to find out how you would sort of put the issue of class into the mix around race. Because Trayvon Martin was from a different class when it came to being categorized as the kids with the pants hanging down. And the reason why I say that is that I have a performing arts center in Camden, on the Camden waterfront. And I work with at-risk kids. But I also have a son that goes to Cherry Hill East, who is an honor roll student, who has gone through the whole process of two-parent household. How does the issue of class, me being middle class, and me also knowing that the kids in the inner city, are pretty much the stereotypical model that is being used when my son, who is an honor student, who is, a citizen of the world, gets categorized from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Tiffany.
Well, for me, it's one of the things that I like to do first and foremost when engaging in a dialogue is to maybe think about tackling the question posed without the definitions. So, people get so caught up in this thing called race or this thing called class that sometimes we can't even move past talking about the real issue. So for me, to respond to your question specifically, how do you engage these youngsters to say, here's an example of what you should be or how you should be trying to present yourself to give yourself access to the same opportunities that appearance per se is, and how it's being received by the majority. First of all, shame on the media as an institution for perpetuating these concepts that you have to look a certain way or dress a certain way, or your hair has to be a certain color, certain length, it has to be, your nails have to be done, whatever it is, in order to be a part of something higher and above yourself. So for me, the middle class doesn't exist anymore. I don't know if you're aware of that. It doesn't exist anymore. And so race, is something that we could have a whole nother conversation about, because I don't believe in it as a genetic construct, rather a social construct. So if you're believing in race as a social construct, what are you really talking about? It's the ways that individuals interact in family, in the music that they listen to. It's the culture of our relationships. It's the things that really matter. So for me, how do you get into the psyche of young people today who are wearing baggy pants and just not doing the things that they need to do to be accepted by the majority? You encourage them to find something unique about themselves and exploit it. And that's how they will get ahead. And it's not necessarily because you want to pattern them off of somebody else who looks like the rest of the majority and is being accepted, because who knows, in a couple of years or a couple of months, that acceptance may change. So it's really about finding a way to connect these young people on an individual basis, which is why I'm an absolute believer and promoter of mentorship. Every young person should have a person that they can go to groom them emotionally, spiritually, psychically, for preparation of how to be yourself in the real world.
Next, did you want to get in? No. Please. Your name, please.
Frederick Harrod. I'm an old warrior. I'm 83 years old. And I worked during the 60s and 70s for Opportunities Industrialization Center under Reverend Leon Sullivan. And I was a troubleshooter, and we had a contract with the national industry that I gave sensitivity seminars to, so that their industries wouldn't be burned down during that period of time. But I wanted to say that we had a lot of emphasis on individuals in terms of racism. But you have to also consider the fact that from the very beginning, the way the people treated the American Indians, of taking the smallpox blankets and trading them for corn, and the Indians all died of smallpox. I sent one gift to an Indian reservation that had contacted me, and then within a month, I had 6 or 7 other Indian reservations sending me information. So Indians are still on reservations. Yeah. We have to remember on a national scale what the United States did to the Japanese citizens during the Second World War when they put them all in camps. And we were fighting Germany too, but there were no camps for Germans, and they had a fun organization in the United States, and swastikas and everything, and parades, but we didn't put them into any kind of internment. So we have to consider the fact that though we had individuals, and it doesn't even count on how you look, Trayvon Martin, because remember the professor at Harvard University arrested in his own house with his picture in his own house and his plaques on the wall, and the police still wanted to arrest him, saying, you know, and then for us as black people to honor the policeman bringing him to the White House and have beard on the lawn was an insult to me.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I just want to say that we have to look at it on not an individual basis, but it's a national scale. Remember, they said to the president when he arrived at Congress, God had yelled out, "You lie." I mean, it's a national thing.
One of the things embedded, thank you. One of the things embedded in that is the idea that our black and brown youth of color who are middle class, to the extent that they exist anymore, immunized to the kind of thing that Trayvon Martin experienced. Does money give you a pass? I see the panel saying no. Why not?
Well, obviously, the young gentleman, and I wish that I could remember his name, maybe Tiffany can pull it up from her notes, in North Carolina, who was shot by the policeman seeking help, from the car accident. He was a college-educated, gentleman, I'm sure an upstanding citizen. If some people recall, several years ago, there were some college students traveling the New Jersey Turnpike, right, on their way home from college, right? And so that's one of the things that I am uniquely mindful of, right? That I am raising a black boy in America. And it doesn't matter how middle or upper class I might become, he will always be a black boy in America. My husband talks about the fact that his reality is very different when he's dressed in a suit than when he's dressed in a sweatsuit, because he's still a black man in America, right? And so, no, class does not immunize you from being black in America any day of the week.
Especially if it doesn't protect you from from a congressperson yelling out as you're the president of the United States, and it's if you've ascended to that level and you still have people yelling out you lie, obviously there are no protections.
So I would just like to add to what my colleagues here said. The class is not going to protect you. And it's that construct, it's that racial construct that we've all been affected by that allows these practices to stay in place, and that's what we have to get at. And I'm still struggling with, but how do we do that on a national, systemic level? All right? I mean, we have these small conversations about race. I think thank you, is a very, very good beginning. So it's one person at a time.
I want to introduce, did you have a question about Trayvon Martin in
yes,
particular?
actually.
Would you please state your name and then who you direct your question to?
My name is Melina Waldo. I actually have a comment about Trayvon Martin, and I have a lot of, I was devastated when he was murdered, and at the verdict as well. And as far as the way he was dressed, he could have been dressed in a suit and tie, and Zimmerman would have still shot him. My grandson, who's 18, could have gone through that stupid gated community, excuse me, in the same dress, you know, the hoodie and the whole thing, as Trayvon Martin, and my grandson would not have been murdered that night. I'm sure that's correct. And the reason I was devastated and totally identified with Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, because of what happened and because I have a son also, and I can not even imagine what she was going through, and a father too, of course. Also, I have a son who's gay, so I've lived with the fear for 22 years that something bad could happen to him. So in addition to identifying with them, I have the same fear. It's not the same. My son can pass, if you will, easier. But he's also in danger, so I have some sense of what that feels like. And although I've always been for equality, until you understand, I have never thought I suffered any prejudice. As a middle-class white woman, I just sailed through life. And then my son came out, so I think I have a better understanding of what prejudice is all about. I just wanted to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Before we go on, I wanted to introduce to you one of our panelists who has just arrived. Got caught on the turnpike, I understand.
I really apologize. That's why I live in New York. I can walk everywhere.
I hear you. I want to introduce to you Linda Carter. Linda currently serves as an assistant professor and director of the Paralegal Studies program at Essex County College. She is also a founder of one of the first African American women law firms in New Jersey. Would you please give her a round of applause? Linda, we were just taking questions on the issue of Trayvon Martin. And so please, sorry for the interruption. Please rise, state your name and who you'd like to direct your question to.
My name is Michelle Jackson, and my question is basically to anyone on the panel. It's somewhat related to Trayvon Martin. I just don't understand, like, what could you do if it's just like a systematic? The reason why I'm saying that, because even after Trayvon Martin, going on now, a young man, I guess for a seatbelt violation, I guess the cops was going to pull him over. He got out and ran. Well, they said the cop didn't run him over. But anyway, he got ran over. They say he was underneath the car, and that's how he died. And it happened to be the same, medical examiner as it was in Trayvon Martin's case. So they're showing this video, all the family showing the video because they believe that the young man was ran over like a dog in Florida. And then my other one is not a question, but it's a statement, more or less, Joyce. When you said something about like black people being considered invisible. Now, when I watched, I guess, the RNC convention, when Clint Eastwood was talking to an empty chair, and I was surprised that nobody, like a lot of people didn't catch that, but I caught it. But that was it.
Why don't you start us out first?
Yeah, I missed my introduction to kind of give you where I'm coming from. But just a comment, and you guys may have already talked about it, but I think everyone needs to understand that race is an artificial construct that is social. However, it is social, and that people are labeled based on the way they look. We as human beings look the way we look because of man's ability to survive in certain areas. And I always use, and I think I took it from Joy DeGruy, is that I always use the Eskimos because they are like a neutral group. And we talk about the Eskimos in terms of particularly their weight. And most people, oh, well, they're heavy and that means they got heart disease. No, they're heavy because the fat protects them against the environment. And so I think if we are educated to know that race is not real, it has no biological foundation. I pulled this book out, Joy DeGruy, on post-traumatic slave syndrome, because she refers to Linnaeus, which many of you may have had or known about him from biology, and how he initiated this whole thing of classifying plants and animals. And then he said, I think I'll go further and classify people. And then he went on to create definitions that for African American women in particular, the fact that they're lascivious, that they basically are there to serve the needs of. And the definitions he gave, which I don't know if I have enough time to read, maybe I'll do it another time later on, that we understand it. There's also, there was a PBS special called Race, the Power of an Illusion. I have that tape too. And in it talks about 3 points. One is that race has no biological foundation, and they look at the science. Second, in terms of all the cases, the Supreme Court cases, and also recognizing that if depending upon what system of slavery that one came through, whether it's under the British or the Spanish, understanding there was slavery under the Dutch and Portuguese and so on, but under the Spanish and the British in particular, because they were the last ones to have control the colonies. If you were one drop, and this goes to our court case, I got it. Our court cases over time, if you had one drop white in the Spanish system, you were considered, even though you were dark, you were considered white. Under the British system, if you had one drop black, no matter how white you look, you were black. In addition to that, our cases, our courts, and the video does a really good job of expanding on this. Depending upon the cases, you can be literally black in Louisiana and go to Alabama and be white. So our cases, our courts have, on a state-by-state basis, made determination who's black and who's white. And many of the cases that come forth have come forth to people that because of their facial or skeleton structure, they are a member of a particular race, thanks to Linnaeus, when in fact that has no bearing on it either. And so the cases came from people who are Japanese or people who came from Pakistan or places like that. And they were considered, because of their skull features, to be Caucasianoids. However, the court had decided that they may have been white, but they're not white for all reasons. And then you have the whole issue about, you had before the suburbs, you had 38 different types of white people.
Linda?
Yes.
Let me ask you this,
Yes.
to tie it more into Trayvon.
Sure.
Race is a social construct.
Right.
Right? But it is apparently a social construct that can get you killed.
Right.
In America.
Right.
Yes.
Right?
Because of the label.
Yes.
Right. So, social construct or not, you get killed because of it, as silly as it may be. So hold on just a second. So what am I supposed to do if I accept and now understand that as a biological issue, race isn't real, but as a social construct, it can get me killed?
Right.
Where do I put the two?
Well, I think it's part of our education and in our education system to go to the PTA meeting, to start spreading the word, give people the literature. Folks need to do the research. And as you spread this and eventually it gets ingrained into the social fabric, it'll take time, because we, for 400 or 500 years, have been operating under another social construct. So we've been labeled that. And you're right, on a day-to-day basis, it's not going to change things. However, that doesn't mean that we don't work to change it, because now we have the knowledge. And some people are going to get iced along the way. However, and we don't want them to, but as long as we have that label. The other thing I just want to go back just to clarify, somebody used the word prejudice, and I think people need to be clear. We use a lot of terminology and we use it interchangeably, and they mean two different things. Prejudice means to prejudge someone, and I think the young lady talked about her son was gay, and so it was about prejudging people. Racism is institutional, right? It's about whether or not you have an impact on a group of people. And in terms, just to come back again in terms of race, I mean, our differences are our cultures. Even within the African American culture, there's cultures. There's the culture of Newark and the culture of Mount Laurel, which I experienced today. The culture of Newark, I can walk around. The culture of Mount Laurel, you know, you can still have black communities. But even with that, you have class, which I kind of heard when I was going.
Gotcha. Yeah,
all right,
you missed some of what we had already said.
Right, in terms of the day-to-day, it becomes part of our education. We've been involved in sort of a socialization, propaganda, constant media. I mean, I look at the Star Ledger, we always, in my community, I grew up in the projects in Newark during the I was there for the '67 rebellion. It wasn't a riot. A riot is what people do when they are drunk at a soccer game. Rebellion, it was rebellion and it was civil disturbance for those who didn't understand what was going on. And, you know, I look at the Star Ledger and I look at the Star Ledger particularly because its perceptions of people in Newark have gone around the state and people have perceptions of the city and people who live there based on their accounts that they get from the Star Ledger. We used to call the Star Ledger the Star Liar.
Okay. Gotcha.
Right. Unfortunately, it makes policy.
Let me, because I want to make sure that we get to the question that was asked. And before we take a break, Joyce, if you can help us, it sounds as though race is a social construct, but it's a mighty powerful one and sometimes a very lethal one. It also sounds to me like, as we rehearse what's been going on, it is a huge burden to carry a legacy of racism and its impact over centuries. Can you talk to a little bit? Because I heard that in your question, the huge burden of needing to bear that.
Right. That's a pretty tall order. The only way that I think that we could even begin to address that, again, it's understanding our history, who we are, and where we come from. We have a legacy in this country of racism, and black and brown boys, I honestly don't know how you guys really grow up, because you're in this shadow, like your son and the sister who spoke earlier, and the young man who got hurt, you know, driving the car. I mean, how do you, it's so hard. It's so hard, but I don't know what it is that we need to teach our young men. Well, I do know what it is, but we have to begin at a very, very early age of letting them know who they are racially, or I should say culturally, because as Sister Linda said, I'm more about the culture. Race is, I mean, people are gonna see us for who we are, who they think we are. But how do we begin to do that paradigm shift? And how do we begin to change that? And that's a hard one.
Tiffany, last comment before we take a break.
You know, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. J.T. Mills, educator at Rowan University in Southern New Jersey. And he is the department head of the African American Studies Department. And I had him on the show because I wanted to get his perspective and share his perspective with our global audience of listeners about what it means for how, first of all, how he self-identifies. I allowed him to tell me that he self-identifies as a black man in today's society. So as a black educator in a college atmosphere or environment, I posed the same question to him. And, you know, we talked earlier, I expressed my opinion earlier that the real change will come about when we are engaging children in the activities that they're already doing in the third, I only have 2 cats, so I'm assuming like third grade, second, third grade, they're already practicing social equity and social justice until their parents see them doing it and then say, don't do that. Why, mommy? Why, daddy? Well, because he's black, or because you're better than that, or they now assign a value to what that child is doing, which makes the disparity exist for the rest of not only their child's life, but every child that child will come into contact with, right? So I asked Dr. Mills, in your opinion, as an educator, where do we start if it's not in third grade? And his response was, you start with white educators because they continue to perpetuate the white value system assigned to every institution in our society. And I say that specifically because the issues with race that America has and has had is very unique to American shores. It's not a global perspective. And I think that's important for people in the United States to know. Our issues of racism are not shared by other continents. And so that means that white educators have to be okay with giving up their tenure and okay with giving up their being comfortable with the same whiteness that they've come to value, especially when they are now given the opportunity and the privilege of teaching new young people coming in. That's where it has to continue after starting in 3rd grade.
Our conversation is not over, but Ken Gordon says that we need to give you all a 15-minute break. We could not stop without talking about Paula Deen, among other things. So take a 15-minute break, but please come back.
Right at 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Scattering going over. I'd like to get a picture of all. Sounds like
I got my hands full. I just want to say hello. I'm very happy to be
Barbara, give me 1 second to grab some pictures. Give me 1 second, we need to get pictures of this.
But I didn't think it
take stuff, move it around, and
Thank you so much.
I am so sorry. I was oblivious.
I know that's where my family is from. Yeah. It does. It's on blogtalkradio.com. So it's on. Yep, Blog Talk Radio. And if you go under Blog Talk Radio, you can just search Mixed Race Radio. So even if you just go online and Google Mixed Race Radio, it'll take you to all of our past episodes, this year,
You have an extra copy. I can take that. No. I will take that because it's my
Yes.